Hey folks, what's up? Picture this, September 1918, the final months of the Great War. The trenches of France are soaked in mud, blood, and chaos. American soldiers are pushing forward with a weapon so terrifying, so brutally effective, that Germany does something unprecedented. They file an official diplomatic protest demanding it be banned from combat. They even threaten to execute any American soldier caught carrying it. What kind of weapon could provoke such a reaction from an empire that deployed poison gas and flamethrowers without hesitation? Today we're diving deep into one of the most controversial firearms in military history, the Winchester Model 1897 Trench Gun. Stick around, because what you're about to discover might just change how you see warfare forever. Now, before we talk about why this shotgun became the center of an international firestorm, we need to understand where it came from and what made it so uniquely American. The Winchester Model 1897 wasn't originally designed for war. In fact, it was created by none other than the legendary firearms designer John Moses Browning, and it hit the civilian market in 1897 as a hunting and sporting shotgun. It was a pump-action design with an external hammer, chambered in 12-gauge, and capable of holding 6 rounds in its tubular magazine. Simple, reliable, and incredibly effective for taking down game. But here's where things get interesting. The Model 97, as it was commonly called, had a unique feature that set it apart from almost every other pump-action shotgun ever made. It lacked what's called a trigger disconnector. What does that mean in practical terms? It means if you held down the trigger and worked the pump action back and forth, the gun would fire every single time the action closed. This feature, known as slam firing, allowed an experienced shooter to empty all 6 rounds in under 2 seconds. Imagine that kind of firepower in the tight confines of a trench where the enemy is just feet away. It was absolutely devastating. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, military strategists quickly realized that traditional bolt-action rifles weren't always the best tools for trench warfare. Combat in the trenches was close, brutal, and chaotic. Soldiers needed weapons that could put out massive firepower at short range, and they needed them fast. The Army looked at what worked well in civilian hands and decided to adapt the Winchester 1897 for military use. They ordered a special variant with a 20-inch barrel, about half the length of standard hunting models, which made it far easier to maneuver in tight spaces, but the modifications didn't stop there. The military version received a perforated steel heat shield that wrapped around the barrel. This wasn't just for show, it protected the shooter's hand from burns during rapid fire, especially when slam firing. They also added a bayonet lug and adapter that allowed soldiers to mount the M1917 bayonet, the same one used on the standard-issue Springfield rifles. With that bayonet fixed, the trench gun became over 39 inches long, a fearsome weapon that could slash, stab, or blow away anything in front of it. The gun also came equipped with sling swivels for easy carrying across muddy battlefields. The ammunition loaded into these shotguns was 12-gauge buckshot, typically containing 6 to 9 lead pellets per shell. Each time the trigger was pulled, those pellets spread out in a cone-shaped pattern, essentially creating a lethal wall of lead. In the narrow, winding trenches where soldiers fought at distances of 10 to 30 feet, accuracy wasn't the primary concern, coverage was. One shell from a trench gun could incapacitate multiple enemies at once, making it an absolute nightmare for anyone on the receiving end. The trench gun earned a variety of nicknames among the troops. Soldiers called it the trench broom and the trench sweeper because it quite literally swept enemy soldiers out of the way. Doughboys, that's what American soldiers were called back then, loved the weapon because it gave them a psychological and tactical edge. When you're about to storm an enemy position and you've got a weapon that can unleash 6 rounds of buckshot into seconds, you feel a lot more confident about your chances of survival. Now, it's important to understand that the Winchester 1897 wasn't the only shotgun used by American forces during World War I. Other models, like the Remington Model 10 and later the Winchester Model 12, also saw service. However, the 1897 became the most iconic because it was the first to be widely issued, and it became the face of America's controversial use of shotguns in combat. Standard riot gun versions of the 1897, which lacked the heat shield and bayonet lug, were also purchased and issued to guards and rear echelon troops, but it was the trench variant that captured the world's attention. By the summer of 1918, American forces were arriving in France in massive numbers, and some units began receiving shipments of trench guns. It didn't take long for these weapons to make an impression. Stories began circulating among both Allied and enemy forces about Americans wielding shotguns with terrifying efficiency. German soldiers who survived encounters with trench guns reported being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of fire and the devastating wounds inflicted by buckshot at close range. The psychological impact was immense just knowing that the enemy had such a weapon changed how Germans approached combat in the trenches. But here's the thing, while the trench gun became legendary, its actual deployment was more limited than popular myth suggests. The weapon arrived relatively late in the war, and logistical challenges meant that not every unit received them. Additionally, the ammunition, especially early paper-hulled shells, was susceptible to moisture, which was a serious problem in the perpetually damp trenches of the Western Front. Despite these limitations, the trench gun's reputation far exceeded its numbers. It became a symbol of American ingenuity and ruthlessness, a weapon that embodied the no-nonsense, get-the-job-done attitude that characterized the American war effort. What made the Model 1897 truly special wasn't just its firepower or its modifications, it was the fact that it represented a uniquely American approach to warfare. Europeans had long traditions of formal, regimented combat. Americans, on the other hand, brought a frontier mentality to the battlefield. Shotguns had been used for decades by lawmen, frontiersmen, and hunters across the United States. Bringing them to the trenches of France wasn't a radical idea for Americans, it was just common sense. But for the Germans, it was something else entirely. It was barbaric, it was uncivilized. And as we'll see in the next chapter, it was something they refused to tolerate without a fight. So we've established that the Winchester 1897 Trench Gun was an absolute beast of a weapon, perfectly suited for the brutal close-quarters combat of World War I trench warfare. But what we haven't talked about yet is the moment when this shotgun went from being just another tool of war to becoming the center of an international controversy that reached the highest levels of government. And believe me, what happened next is one of the wildest stories in military history. In July 1918, German forces began capturing American soldiers who were carrying trench shotguns. At first, this wasn't particularly unusual. Prisoners were taken all the time on both sides. But something about these shotguns disturbed the German high command. Reports started filtering back about the devastating effects of buckshot in trench fighting, and German soldiers who survived encounters with American shotgunners described wounds unlike anything they'd seen before. Multiple pellets tearing through flesh, bones shattered, men cut down in groups. It was horrific, even by the standards of a war that had already killed millions. The German government decided to take action. On September 19, 1918, the United States Secretary of State received a formal diplomatic protest via cablegram from Germany. Let me read you the exact wording, because it's absolutely wild. The German government protests against the use of shotguns by the American Army and calls attention to the fact that according to the law of war, every U.S. prisoner of war found to have in his possession such guns or ammunition belonging there to forfeits his life. This protest is based upon Article 23 of the Hague Convention respecting the laws and customs of war on land. Reply by cable is required before October 1, 1918. Read that again. Germany wasn't just complaining, they were threatening to execute American prisoners of war if they were caught with a shotgun or even shotgun ammunition. This was an unprecedented escalation. Germany was essentially declaring that possession of a specific type of weapon was grounds for summary execution, and they cited international law to justify it. Specifically, they pointed to Article 23E of the 1907 Hague Convention, which prohibited the use of weapons calculated to cause unnecessary suffering. Now, let's talk about the sheer audacity of this protest. Germany, the same nation that had introduced chlorine gas and mustard gas to the battlefield weapons that caused excruciating, lingering deaths, was suddenly concerned about unnecessary suffering. Germany, which deployed flamethrowers that burned men alive in their trenches, was now claiming the moral high ground. Germany, whose soldiers carried serrated bayonets specifically designed to cause more severe wounds, was protesting the use of buckshot. The hypocrisy was staggering, and the Americans didn't waste any time pointing it out. The response from the United States government was swift and uncompromising. The acting Judge Advocate General of the U.S. Army, Brigadier General Samuel T. Ansel, prepared a detailed memorandum on September 26, 1918, completely debunking the German protest. Ansel dismantled their legal arguments point by point. He explained that shotguns were no more inhumane than shrapnel shells, machine gun fire, or any other weapon commonly used in the war. He noted that buckshot wounds, while severe, were not categorically different from wounds caused by other projectiles. In legal and ballistic terms, the German complaint was baseless. Ansel concluded that the protest was without legal merit, but the American response went beyond just legal arguments. Secretary of State Robert Lansing made it crystal clear that if Germany carried out its threat to execute American prisoners, even in a single instance, the United States would retaliate in kind. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, reportedly issued a counter-threat that any German soldier captured with a flamethrower or serrated bayonet would face the same fate. The message was unmistakable: if you execute our boys, we'll execute yours. The Germans backed down. Despite their threats, there are no documented cases of American soldiers being executed for possessing shotguns or shotgun ammunition during World War I, whether this was due to the American counter-threats, basic human decency, or simply the practical reality that the war was almost over. It ended just 6 weeks after the German protest. We'll never know for sure. But the fact remains, the trench gun had rattled the German Empire so badly that they resorted to diplomatic threats and propaganda campaigns to try to stop its use. And speaking of propaganda, the Germans didn't just stop at diplomatic channels. German newspapers launched a smear campaign against American soldiers, painting them as savages and barbarians. The Cologne Gazette, one of Germany's major newspapers at the time, published articles suggesting that Americans would soon be using tomahawks and scalping knives on the battlefield. One article declared that Americans are not honorable warriors, attempting to portray the use of shotguns as evidence of American barbarism. The irony, of course, was that this was coming from the same nation that had violated Belgian neutrality, deployed chemical weapons, and conducted unrestricted submarine warfare. The American military responded to the controversy in a somewhat unexpected way. While they refused to stop using trench guns, they did begin censoring photographs of American soldiers carrying shotguns. The goal wasn't to appease Germany, it was to avoid inflaming the situation further and potentially causing diplomatic friction with other allied nations. The British and French, for their part, had actually evaluated shotguns for trench warfare earlier in the war, but decided not to adopt them, primarily due to concerns about ammunition reliability in wet conditions and slower reload times compared to rifles. The American use of shotguns was, in many ways, a uniquely American approach that didn't quite fit with European military traditions. It's worth noting that despite the enormous publicity surrounding the trench gun, its actual impact on the war was probably more psychological than tactical. As I mentioned earlier, the weapon arrived relatively late in the conflict, and distribution was limited. Many American soldiers never even saw a trench gun, let alone used one in combat. But the fact that the weapon caused such an uproar tells us something important. Sometimes the fear of a weapon is just as powerful as the weapon itself. The Germans were terrified of the trench gun, and that fear spread through their ranks, affecting morale and tactics. After the war ended in November 1918, Germany attempted to have shotguns banned under international law during various disarmament conferences in the 1920s and 1930s. These efforts were similar to British attempts to ban submarines as ungentlemanly weapons. Neither campaign succeeded. Shotguns remained legal weapons of war, and the Winchester 1897 continued to serve in American military arsenals for decades. It saw action again in World War II, though it was gradually replaced by the hammerless Winchester Model 12. The 1897 even made appearances in later conflicts, including limited use during the Vietnam War. So what's the final verdict on the Winchester M1897 Trench Gun? Was it a war crime waiting to happen, or just another tool in the American arsenal? The answer is clear. It was a perfectly legal, devastatingly effective weapon that scared the hell out of the enemy. The German protest had nothing to do with international law or humanitarian concerns. It was pure propaganda, designed to counter a weapon they couldn't match. The trench gun worked, it saved American lives, and it became a legend precisely because it was so effective that the enemy tried to have it banned. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think the German protest was legitimate, or was it just sour grapes from an empire losing the war? Would you have wanted a trench gun in your hands if you were storming enemy trenches in 1918? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most controversial weapons in history, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.